Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. Here at the museum we tell the story of the British Army and the people who served in it, from the Civil Wars to the present day, through our galleries, collections, programmes and research. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. I'm delighted to welcome Tim Grady. Tim is Professor of Modern European History at the University of Chester and the author of Burying the Enemy, the story of those who cared for the dead in 2 world wars. He's previously written extensively on German and Jewish history, including European fascist movements with Roland Clark, A Deadly Legacy, German Jews and the Great War, and the German Jewish soldiers of the First World War in History and Memory. Today, he'll be sharing some poignant examples of British and German communities burying the war dead of their enemy during times of conflict. There'll be time at the end for questions. So if you're in the room, please raise your hand. I'll bring around the mic for you to ask your questions. If you're online, you can place those questions in the Q&A chat feature, and we'll put them to Tim at the end. Moving on with some technical points for our people joining us online. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. Also today, Tim will be signing copies of his book, Burying the Enemy, so I'll whisk him upstairs to our bookshop afterwards where you can get a signed copy. With all that said, I'm now going to hand over to Tim.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that really kind introduction, and thank you everybody for coming along today. It's really nice. It's lovely to see such a full room here, and I believe quite a full room online too. So thank you everybody for coming along. So I'm going to talk about this history really to do with the First World War and the Second World War. But before doing that, I'm actually just going to take us back to a little bit more recent past. I'm going to take us back to November 2018. So we're going to start there, really. And why I'm taking us back to November 2018 is because in the run-up to the annual Remembrance Day ceremonies, there was a bit of a scandal that took place, and some of you might remember this. I mean, it was in the press at the time. But the scandal, or the controversy, I suppose is more the word, that took place was really based on the fact, because of who was invited to lay a wreath at the cenotaph. And the man that was invited to lay a wreath, where the controversy surrounded, it was this man. Probably familiar figure, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, president of Germany, the German president. So he'd been invited to lay a wreath. And it was... So this is going back again in recent history, but it was then Prime Minister Theresa May that had invited Steinmeier to lay this wreath. And I guess there were a couple of reasons for this. The first was November 2018. So we're dealing with, the end of the centenary of the First World War period. So that was the main reason. But it's also to do with improving British-German relations post-Brexit as well. Okay, so that was the reason behind that, and that's what happened. But there was a bit, when the news broke, there was a bit of a kind of, a bit of a scandal in the press, in some sections of the press. So we had, the Sun called this Hands of Peace. Top brass fear secret plans to invite Germany's president to the cenotaph. The Mail went with one angry veteran is one too many. Ex-army chief warns against inviting the German president to the cenotaph. So there was a little bit of criticism of this. And I guess the underlying implication really was that this was very much a British space of memory, and we had to keep the two sides apart. The idea being the former wartime enemies belonged in one place and the others belonged somewhere else. What I want to talk about today, though, is that actually when we look back at the historical record, these divisions they're not really there to the same extent. And actually, when you look at the way that people during the First and Second World Wars, and immediately after as well too, there wasn't always such a sense of division. That's the kind of point I'm trying to try and make today. And I'm going to try and do that by exploring this question of the enemy war dead. Specifically, Germans that died in this country in the two world wars, so on the home front, and in reverse, British soldiers who died in Germany in the two world wars. So that's the focus. From these headlines, you might imagine, really, I suppose, that those people who died, the enemy that died here, or the British that died in Germany, would very much have been ignored, forgotten, neglected. The history that I'm trying to tell, though, is slightly different, and it's more of an entangled history of wartime loss, an entangled history of wartime loss on the home fronts. One that often reveals, I suppose, kind of narratives of care and relations at times too, tender relations. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about. I think we need to start, though, with a very basic or important question, I suppose, which is, how did the enemy actually die on the home front? So we've got to go back to the beginning of this story. Now, if we were talking about the Western Front in the First World War, I think we'd quite quickly find the answer to this. The answer would be probably reasonably straightforward. But our focus here is on, or my focus, is on the home front, or the home fronts. So I'm dealing here with enemy deaths in London, Luton, Loughborough, wherever, or in Berlin, Bremen, Bonn, and so on and so forth. So the enemy who dies at home. And I think if I try and answer this, what I'm going to do is think about four categories here, four categories of deaths. The first of these would be combatant deaths. And the largest number of combatant deaths is during the Second World War, but principally dealing here with the air war. That's our largest number, dealing the air war in terms of bombing raids over both countries. But as we're in the National Army Museum, I'm not going to go down any further down that avenue today. When it comes to the army, I suppose it's a bit more of a limited history in terms of combatant deaths, because during the First World War, we're not dealing with enemy forces on British territory during the war, and the same if you go over to Germany. And then when it comes to the Second World War, we don't have British troops here within Britain, but we do, of course, have British troops in the final period of the conflict entering German territory, really from the period of Market Garden onwards. And here we do have Allied casualties, of course, as the British forces advance into Germany. So that would be our first category of deaths, combatant deaths, people who died on the home front. So that's category one. But it's category two that I want to say a bit more about, and that would be deaths in captivity. So people who are captured, taken as prisoners of war, and held in POW camps. So that's my second category of deaths on the home front. So both Britain, or both the British and the Germans, capture soldiers, and then they return them, both in the First World War and the Second World War, to the home front into captivity. And of course, some of these men do die in captivity, which means the enemy is dying at home. And I'm going to give an example of this, one case study here. Now, apologies, this case study is a bit closer to home for me than it might be for you in London, because it comes from Cheshire, and that's where I've popped down from. So the case study here is from the Handful prisoner of war camp, which is in Cheshire. more Wilmslow way, really. And it is actually, though, one of the larger POW camps that the British have in the First World War. And it's built around this former factory, which you could see from the building, from the image there, factory-like building. Now, during the First World War, about 19 Germans die while being held in this facility. And kind of helpfully for us, post-war, former German POWs put down a kind of memorial plaque, a memorial plate, listing all the names of these 19 POWs who died in Cheshire in the First World War. And they're all listed here for us. Now, if we look at that, we've got the names and we've got the date in which they died on the right-hand side there as well. Now, the first man listed here, Fritz Dries, was who died in 1915, November 1915. He was his POW card. He was a reservist. He died, as it states here. So this is the list of his. This comes from the POW records, and it says there on the right-hand column, he died really from tubercular infection of the left lung, and he died in Hamforth in Cheshire. So he dies here. This is his cause of death. So he's a 23-year-old, and he dies November 1915 from this infection of the lungs. So that is an enemy death, a German death, within fairly rural Cheshire. And we go back to our list here. If you look at, you can see the next couple of names. We've got 1916, 1917, early 1918 there. Hartmann from early 1918. They were also from sickness or poor health as well, people died. But then we've got a whole string of names going down 1918. And I'm sure people will know this, of course, but what's happening towards the end of the war, in the First World War, is the influenza pandemic. All these men then are dying from the influenza pandemic that's going around the world. So from this global pandemic. And that's quite typical for a lot of the POW camps in the First World War. Later on in the POW camps, influenza is rife and it runs through the camps. The only exception is, apologies, he's very much at the bottom of the screen there. Wilhelm Schmidt, the last name, you probably won't make it out, but the last name listed, he was not a victim of the influenza pandemic. He was shot by a British Guard accidentally, according to the coroner's report. The coroner's report goes in to say this man Schmidt kept going near the fence and pestering the guards for cigarettes. Kept saying, "Oh, give us a cigarette, please, can I have a cigarette?" Kept asking until the guard got so fed up, he drew his rifle and said, "Look, would you just go?" And then it accidentally went off, is what the coroner's report says. But he was fatally wounded, and here's the final death in Hamforth. There were quite a few other incidents of accidental deaths, shootings in camps. So this gives us then an idea of deaths in captivity as our second big category here. My third category of, if we're going back to this question of how did the enemy die on the home front, my third category is from wounds, the war wounded. Because we get a lot of people captured on the front lines and taken into captivity, into POW camps. But we also get a lot of people captured on the front lines and they're already really badly wounded. So they're not taken into POW camps, they're taken straight into hospitals for treatment, for recovery, for recuperation, try and deal with these frontline battle wounds. And that is actually quite a large category, particularly in the First World War. Some of these people are brought to exist in hospitals. Sometimes we're dealing with special hospital wings where the enemy is treated, such as in Dartford or in Manchester. There's separate hospital wings just for the enemy in the First World War. Now we get a really good glimpse of what happened to these wounded servicemen in the First World War in the UK, in Britain, from these records from the Prisoners of War Information Bureau. Now, this was an organisation that put together all details of German prisoners in this country, and it was particularly had this kind of questionnaire, and we've got an example of questionnaire here, and he used this questionnaire for the wounded and for those who did not recover from their injuries. And there's piles of these in the National Archives in Germany, in the Bundesarchiv, and a few years back went through these. And I just found them a really revealing document, really. They really went into the fate of so many soldiers, so many enemy soldiers from the First World War, and explained quite poignantly at times of how they died within Britain. So here, for example, we've got this man, Gerhard Pohl, who's been taken to Dartford War Hospital in Kent with these specific injuries that he then dies from. A gunshot wound, face with a compound fracture, flesh wounds as well, and then this hemorrhage from shrapnel in the lung too. So he's in a really bad way. And he dies from these wounds in Dartford, Kent, in August 1918. Now, as I say, there's piles and piles of these forms that were filled in by the Prisoner of War Information Bureau with the medical teams at the time, and then they were sent over to Germany to be passed back to families. That was the purpose of these forms. But when you go through with them, some of them were really quite poignant, because the final two questions, which say, did he leave any message? This one just says no. Other features of interest to his relatives, i.e. to his German relatives. What else might they like to know? These sometimes were filled with quite poignant information. And I've got a couple here. So this man, and we can see he's badly wounded again, grenade wound, head penetrating. And then the question, other features of interest to his relatives, the prisoner of war did not suffer much. But quite often you think he probably did suffer quite a lot, but they're saying he did not suffer much. This person, compound fracture, he's had an amputation and suffers then from heart failure. The prisoner of war sent his greetings to his family and hoped to see them again. Or this final one, and this person seems is in Dartford as well, but in a really bad way. Gunshot wound to the back of the chest, septic pneumonia. The prisoner of war did not suffer much. His thoughts were of his relatives during the whole time he was in hospital. Actually, I think I might have one more. I said it was the last one. I've got one more. This person, gunshot wound, left hand, and a gunshot wound to his spine as well, and his spinal meningitis. Awful condition. But again, the prisoner of war, the message to his relatives is the prisoner of war did not suffer much. He was severely wounded. He had no chance of recovery. Everything was done, possible was done to make him, to relieve his pain and make him comfortable. So when these are being filled in, these forms are being filled in quite poignantly for the relatives, to give them some sort of sense of something to hang on to. So when they know that their loved one has died as a POW in this country, there's something here to give them a sense of he wasn't alone. We were looking after him. And to me, this kind of suggests a strong sense of common humanity here, crossing over the borders, crossing over the divide. Not just about division, but some sense of common understanding here when it comes to wartime deaths. Just going to take a sip of water. But I did promise you 4 categories of deaths, so I've just got to say the 4th one. So we've had combat deaths, we had deaths in internment, and we've got enemy deaths because of war wounds. The 4th one I want to mention is really post-war deaths. And that, because I think that's also part of the narrative here, really. Okay, the First World War ends in 1918, the Second World War, 1945. But deaths involving the enemy don't end at that point. They do carry on. It's not technically so much the enemy at this point. We're starting to get towards former enemy. But the British hold POWs, prisoners of war, in this country until the end of 1919, and again through to 1948 after the Second World War. So we've still got Germans in this country once the fighting's over, both conflicts. And then we've also got British occupation troops in Germany after the two conflicts too. And in this sort of early post-war period, you're still dealing with deaths of what would be almost the enemy at this time. Often deaths, though, by this time are more about accidents or something going wrong or something, often sort of to do with almost like the euphoria of the war ending. So there's quite a few deaths of people drinking too much and then hurting themselves. There's so many incidences of the people jumping in the Rhine, British soldiers jumping in the Rhine to cool down or something and then drowning. Several German prisoners of war die in things like bicycle accidents after the Second World War, when they're allowed to cycle to their place of work, and then the war's over, they're still being held captive in this country, and then fall off their bike or get knocked over by a lorry, and so on. But here's one. This is from 1946. It's a recording from the Imperial War Museum. This man, Frank Russell, from the Royal Tank Regiment, talks about, he recalls, well, one of our chaps went on leave. Whilst he was on leave, he got engaged back in Britain. But then when he came back, he went swimming in this lake in Germany and drowned. And he was in my troop. And that was 1946. So there's a lot of deaths that are taking place just through accidents, as really, you'd have thought the real dangers of the conflict are passing. So, okay, so those are our categories of fatalities here, those who are killed. But my next question is really, what happened then to the bodies? So people are dying. What happens to the bodies? Because I suppose the big thing here is that people die, and that's not the end of the message. That's not the end of the history, because a body remains, the enemy body remains, and something's got to happen to that body. And I think dealing with the body, dealing with the remains, proves to be quite important for British-German relations in this history. And I suppose the pivot, or the kind of key thing for me when I look at this, is the fact that when people died, their bodies weren't moved hundreds of miles away to a central cemetery or put somewhere else. Practical reasons, people tended to be buried very close to where they died, where they lost their lives. So if we go back to the first person I mentioned, Fritz Dries, who died in the Hamforth prisoner of war camp, and he died in November 1915. His body, now I apologise, I should have made this go up here really, but his body was placed in Wilmslow, in the Wilmslow municipal cemetery in Wilmslow. So he dies near Wilmslow, he's buried near Wilmslow. But all these other people, this is just a random page from the registers that were the Red Cross were collecting, but other Germans here from the First World War, buried in Devonport, in Scotland, in Portsmouth, in Dorchester, in Colchester, Dorchester again, in Dartford. People are basically buried near where they die, is the message here. So and the same kind of applied in Germany too. So the British soldier that died in 1946, cooling off in the lake, come back from leave after just being engaged. Well, that officer said, well, we buried him in the local churchyard in Germany. That's where we left him. The result of this then is that there were hundreds of cemeteries or parish churchyards or what have you across Britain and Germany that then contain the graves of the enemy. So they're all over. In this country, it's probably about 700, almost getting on for 750 different cemeteries and churchyards in Britain that contain German bodies from World War I and World War II. So you can go all over the country and you'd find all these different German graves because the enemy is being buried near where they died. Sadly, I've never managed to pin down the exact number in reverse, but I would imagine it's more cemeteries in Germany that contained British graves. But the big message here again is that we're not dealing with some kind of separation, that the Germans are there and the British are over there. Everybody's been kind of buried together, scattered together, all around these countries. There isn't really a separation at the time of the conflict between all these different, or between the two sides. Now, because the enemy is being buried locally in Portsmouth or Dorchester or Colchester or wherever it is, this meant that actually it became quite public affairs because people are being buried, or the enemy's being buried in the local churchyard. And people see this. It's not hidden away. People are seeing the enemy, their wartime foe, being laid to rest on their doorstep. So if we go back to Hamforth, back to Cheshire, Hamforth here, see it's a very rural place. This is the overview of the OS map of the time. Very rural place, this bit of Cheshire at the time. The red circle is where the prisoner of war camp was. That little red circle there. The blue circle is where the cemetery is, okay? That's where Fritz Dries and all the other Germans were buried, in that cemetery. So they're not buried in the same place. But that meant you had to get to, from one to the other. He dies there, he's got to get there. So the body is taken then along the streets, in very public view, to the cemetery. Which means we have scenes like this in a lot of towns and villages and communities across the country. German prisoners taking the body of one of the other prisoners who's died to the cemetery, with guards present, but local people also looking on. Sometimes, this isn't one of them, but some of these burials, there was a vast number of people on the streets to see these. One from the First World War, actually, and a few from the Second World War in Edinburgh. The streets were lined with people who'd come to see the burial of German dead. So very, very well, not necessarily marked, but very, very, very visible moments in this history. In Germany, there's a Second World War burial. Not all, but quite a few of the soldiers are also buried in rather public cemeteries, where people are seeing the enemy be placed into their local communities, supposedly permanently. Now, clearly, propaganda plays a big role in all of this as too. Propaganda certainly played a role here, because both sides are trying to stress, look what we're doing with the enemy. We're treating them so well. We're treating the bodies perfectly. We're respecting them, and so on and so forth. So propaganda played a big role in all this, which is why there's quite a few photos of a lot of what went on, because you're trying to demonstrate that you're treating the war dead with some degree of respect. But regardless, what we're seeing again is this kind of sense of shared loss that did shared casualties that is stretching across the borders. Okay, so the people are dying and they're buried locally, but how were the graves marked then? That's the next question here. How were the graves marked? So we've got funerals, quite public funerals. People are placed into the cemeteries, laid to rest. Now, the basic stipulation, according to international law, was that the grave should be marked with a basic grave marker, perhaps a wooden cross, something along these lines, to ensure that the grave's not forgotten, we know where it is. That did tend to happen. Not always, but it did tend to happen. But in some cases, this was also exceeded and people went beyond this. But where people went beyond this, it was quite often because the grave markers then were being placed by fellow prisoners of war. So when somebody had died in a POW camp, our second category, POW camp deaths, that meant there were other people who might have known that soldier, who'd known that person who'd died. And in those circumstances, sometimes fellow POWs sort of came together to try and get the money to place a much larger and more significant grave marker over the grave. One here, a lot of northern examples, I'm afraid. Altrincham, south of Manchester. A First World War grave here from this man, Georg Eid, who'd died. There was a very small POW camp in Altrincham. He was the only person who died in it. But this grave, this was placed over his grave to mark where he was lying to rest in the town cemetery of Altrincham. And you can, well, it's very hard to make out, but it's also all inscribed there with German writing all the way down. So it's very visibly a German grave. And standing alongside it is the parish priest of Altrincham too, next to the German grave. Sometimes prisoners seem to get, they must have had a lot of time on their hands, perhaps a lot of money too, and they managed to create some astonishingly large memorials for the German dead. So this one's from Oswestry. There was a big prisoner of war camp from the First World War again, Park Hall prisoner of war camp. And this massive structure, there was graves all around it, German war graves, but was placed right in the middle of it, which is quite a landmark on the surroundings there. You wouldn't have missed that as being, a German enemy war graves in the heart of Oswestry. Then after the Second World War, we got similar going on. This is Bridgewater in Somerset. And you can see, look, this is just the standard municipal cemetery here in Bridgewater. But we've got German graves. There's a few scattered down at the front. One whole German army there. He actually dies 1947. So post-war death in our fourth category. But alongside to the right, just there's a completely different stone that's been placed there for two people, Clem and Shear, and that's been put in. I think that one might have been bought by relatives who placed that there post-war, that one. But it's a very different type of stone as well. So my point is that these graves are being marked. Here we have in Germany, actually, in Hohenfels. This is Australian and British POW graves here. And this is in the local cemetery there in Bavaria. I suppose each grave then is really making the enemy's presence very visible on the home front, because you go into these cemeteries, when you're going to see your uncle, your aunt's grave or whatever, you're going to stumble across German graves too. They're not hidden away, they're not lost, they're not forgotten, they're there, they're visible. Now, and I suppose particularly because the inscriptions and the symbols are in German or in English too, so it's making it quite obvious that this is an outsider from the other side. So, okay, what happens then, okay, when the war's over, when the fighting stops, what happens at this point? Well, this is, I suppose, the other pivot I've got in this book, really, is when the fighting stops, the picture doesn't really change. And it doesn't change because the bodies aren't returned, they're not repatriated. The bodies remain in Britain and they remain in Germany. So at the war's end, you know, it's one thing to bring prisoners of war home. That's more straightforward. To bring bodies home would have been quite a challenge because you'd have had to exhume them all, ship them all back to Britain or to Germany. That's much more challenging, much more tricky. It's actually much more tricky dealing with the dead than it was with the living. So the bodies remain, and that's also part of the policy of the Imperial War Graves Commission, as it was at the time, of non-repatriation too. But because the bodies remain in Britain and Germany, the enemy bodies, they actually become this kind of important site of memory. They actually become a kind of opportunity to build relations between friend and foe, between former enemies, because all these bodies are around both countries. And in the post-war, as soon as the fighting stops in this kind of post-war world, you start to get kind of contacts between both sides. People have been wanting to they want to know what's happened to their loved one. They want to know what's happened to the grave, potentially to go and see it. So they start to try and make contacts, or they start to try and work out, okay, could I get over to X, Y, or Z, wherever my husband or my son is buried, and see the grave? And this means that actually the graves become quite important for contacts and for relations between both sides. So in the post-war world, you start to get a lot of correspondence, letters, going back and forth between both Britain and Germany, between some small communities in one place and some small communities in the other place. So I'll give one example here. This is to do with a man called Friedrich Dutton. Let's make him a bit bigger. Friedrich Dutton here, who, Royal Engineers, born 1898 in London, a family by this stage in Essex. But he dies in September 1918 as a prisoner of war in Worms through dysentery, because actually this prisoner of war camp was really bad state. And he's buried in the main cemetery in Worms, Worms Hochheim. But the war's end, the parents, or indeed actually it's the father, wants to find out what's happened to the grave. And he starts writing to the council and other officials in Worms about his son. And it leads to a whole string of correspondence. So he's writing saying, I just want details of my these are his words, poor boy's grave. Where is he? What's happened? And the official in Worms writes back and say, look, I'm going to go and have a look. I'm going to go to the cemetery. I'm going to find the grave. And I'm going to write back to you and tell you. And he does that. And then the exchanges continue. And he said, well, I'll lay some flowers for you on the grave. And then he says, I'll come back and I'll take a photo too. And I'll see if I can arrange a photo of the grave in our town and send it back to you, because I understand what you're going through. I understand your grief. I understand your loss. And they end up in such detailed correspondence where they're both sides are sort of, whatever we do, we don't want any more war. We've got to sort of build out of this. Let's try and make a better world. This is so awful. And they try and develop out. And the sort of correspondence relations continue in this way. And there's loads of examples along these lines. Once the Duttons know the grave is there, then they feel more confident that they can go over and travel to Germany. Because what this soldier's father says is, it would just break my wife's heart if we went there and we couldn't find the grave and there was nothing to see. So they want to know before they travel what things are like. in the post-war years, you start to get a lot of travel that does take place between these different sites, to random places in both countries. But you also start to get, because these graves are still there, you start to get local people often start to take some of the enemy graves into their own hands and say, we're going to look after this grave. We know such and such is buried in our cemetery. We want to look after it as a kind of act of reconciliation, as a kind of act of building out of war. Bishop Stortford here. Now, typical British cemetery. You can see the kind of interwar housing there behind in the background. But it's got 15 German prisoners of war, the Second World War, buried here. Now, for some reason, a mother and daughter almost take these graves into their own care and decide they're going to look after the graves. And they spend a lot of their money on caring for them. They spend a lot of their time placing all these flowers on them. This drawing is from the daughter, I think, and the flowers are what they've placed on the graves. So they start to look after them. They're weeding them, and they're the ones liaising with the relatives in Germany. And the daughter says, to quote her, "It's one of the greatest pleasures in my life is to look after these German graves." And there's many similar examples like this that go on. Okay, but I suppose the point again is they're not separate. The enemy dead's not separate. They're within our midst. The final point I want to make before I close: why are these scenes? We don't see these scenes today. So why are these scenes no longer repeated? That's because this is rather a brief moment, I suppose. The graves in Bishop Stortford are no longer there. In Wilmslow, which is the example I started with, which is where the German war dead from Handful, and it says Handful, if you can make out the bottom of that headstone there, where they were buried, so they're buried in Wilmslow. And this is a shot from 1956 in Wilmslow. And this is the big memorial that's put up for the 19 German dead. If you go there, this is quite a poor PowerPoint trick, but if you go there today, there's just some conifers. You'd never know that they were ever there, because there's no sign of them. The scene today, the scene before was 56. The scene today is there's no sign at all. The reason for that is because in both Britain and Germany, the dead are still in Britain and Germany, but they've been moved to central cemeteries. So if you want to find the British dead in Germany today, well, they've been moved to the Commonwealth War Graves cemeteries, and there's 4 big ones that the War Graves Commission established in Germany from the mid-1920s onwards, and these are the 4 big war cemeteries there, established mid-20s. And then late 40s, the British, or the Imperial War Graves Commission, established a further 9 cemeteries in Germany for the Second World War dead. This just left behind then the German dead in this country. And the Germans waited a lot longer until they tried to do something similar. What they had to wait for was for a formal treaty to be signed. Just make out 1959, an agreement between the UK and the Federal Republic of Germany regarding German war graves in the United Kingdom. So a treaty is signed in 1959, and that allows the Germans to move all their dead from Wilmslow and Colchester and Oswestry and wherever else to a new cemetery that they establish on Cannock Chase, the Cannock Chase German Military Cemetery, and this is it today. Okay. Well, at this point then, so that's where we kind of end up, I'm going to conclude. So what I want to say, I suppose, in conclusion then, is really that the enemy dead, both in Germany and in this country, were once part of a kind of memory, local memory of both world wars. They died locally and they were buried locally. They weren't completely separate. They weren't separated out originally. They weren't absent from the way people talked about the wars and thought about the wars. When they've been exhumed to larger cemeteries, though, they have kind of lost their place a little bit more in national memory of the two conflicts. And it's perhaps because of these voids and these changes, since they've emerged, that we've ended up in a bit more of a them and us situation once again when we think about the wars. And it's perhaps because of that there was indeed uproar when Frank-Walter Steinmeier laid his wreath at the cenotaph. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Tim.